Okay, now we're looking at classical stages of history, the classical stages of history. This is an interesting concept. And this will give us the big picture. This will give us the big picture. So the idea of the classical stages of production, or the classical stages of history, started with Turgot, who was a physiocrat around the 1750s. So that both Turgot, Adam Smith, and Karl Marx had the same conception of the classical stages of history. And I showed you the capital structure in the last session about stages of production and time preferences during those classical stages. So the first stage is the hunter-gatherer tribes, and this was before the beginning of history. So again, human being collective activity started about 1200, was called before the Common Era. And then in Samaria, 4500 before the Common Era, that's when you start to get the beginning of the recorded word. So that's when history begins. Marx thought that history would begin with the revolution when everything was owned in common, but that's never occurred in history. All Marxist revolutions have just created the dictatorial or authoritarian states. So then you get the first the Wall of Jericho, which is the first evident capital accumulation. So there's a debate whether this Wall of Jericho is ornamental, in other words, is it art, or is it a form of defense? And of course, it was before the beginning of recorded history, so you don't know what form this. Well, you started with philosophy, with accumulation really started with cave paintings, when people were using art to capture their day-to-day lives. And then the next stage of history is small-scale farming and animal husbandry. And you hear about this thing called globalization. Well, and why that's bad or not good. But the Foundation for Economic Education was the homework assignment you did. Their whole point was common economic interests lead to peace. That's why the Foundation for Economic Education was founded. And then you start to get small-scale farming and animal husbandry, and people become sedentary. And then this then leads to antiquity. And of course, they had tremendous accumulation in architecture and art during the and law during the classical period. And now slavery is not a form of history, or is not a stage of history. Slavery is still with us in some places. But we'll look at the development of capitalism and the classical liberal period of history, or early capitalism. And I define early capitalism starting with 1870, with the end of slavery in the United States. That would be the classical liberal period of history, or the libertarian period of history. When you had free trade, the gold standard, and a small state. And that all ended with World War I, which then led to modern capitalism, under which we're in today. So then the Roman Republic becomes an empire, and therefore unsustainable by violating the rule of law and monetary and fiscal policy by overextending itself. The empire overextended itself. And we'll study that. And then, so that was the collapse of, at the time, Western civilization. And then that led to what's known as the Dark Ages, when the center of intellectual activity moves to Islam. And then you get, so with the collapse of the Roman Empire, you get a different economic structure. And that economic structure is known as feudalism, where you have decentralized manors, decentralized mansion houses. And people are attached to the land around these mansion houses, manorial economic system. And those are called serfs. And that period of history is called feudalism. And again, we'll discuss that feudalism when we talk about the early modern period or early capitalism. So what happens is these different stages of history at different times and places fall apart, and then a new form or stage of history develops. Right, so Karl Marx, Adam Smith called our current period of history the commercial society, where it's based around a rule of law instead of a divine right to rule, commercial society, which is founded on the Enlightenment. So you get the Enlightenment, John Locke, 1690, property rights, feudalism goes away, capitalism develops with the agricultural productivity under feudalism, primitive accumulation. And then this current period, so you get the early capitalism of the classical liberal period, then you get World War I, and then the 30-year crisis, which World War I, the Depression, World War II, and then a new structure emerges, which is the solidification of the nation state and international institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, and the International Monetary Fund and the UN. So you'd call that perhaps the New World Order or modern capitalism. But I would propose that we're now under a sub-form of modern capitalism, which would be political capitalism. So that's, again, the classical stages of history, which will no doubt be on your midterm exam, are hunter-gatherer tribes, small-scale farming, feudalism, and capitalism or commercial society in chronological order. And then the defining characteristics of each.